everybody. Today we're going to be covering section 5.3, which is about something called the Green Revolution. The learning objective for today is that you can describe changes in agricultural practices, and the essential knowledge that you're going to gain is essentially like what the Green Revolution is, and some of the pros and cons that comes with the technologies that we have now because of it. All right, so let's first start off with what is the Green Revolution. So this was going to be a shift in agriculture away from small family-operated farms to large industrial-scale agribusiness, and this occurred in the 1950s to 1960s, and we're talking about in the United States here. Now, this was a movement that was greatly supported by the United States, and many wealthy families like the Rockefellers contributed a lot of money to it because the goal was to be able to make it so that we could feed people more efficiently and leading to more people not having to die from famines and disease and starvation, which was kind of a thing before this time period. So what it led to is an increased use of mechanization, things like tractors, tillers, processing plants, GMOs, which stands for genetically modified organisms, irrigation, fertilizers, and pesticides. Now, one of the really important things to be aware of with this topic, but also with all of environmental science, is going to be this idea of pros and cons. For everything that we have, there's going to be benefits, and then there's going to be downsides. And a lot of the times the conversation with this is just trying to weigh those pros and cons for what is worth it and what might not be worth it, but recognizing that those go hand in hand, and it isn't as simple as like, oh, this is a bad thing or this is a good thing, that it's always going to be really nuanced. So the big benefit of this is the fact that the Green Revolution greatly increased our efficiency of lands, our short-term profitability, and food supply. And ultimately why this matters is it means that billions of people eat. And so we're decreasing the starvation that happens. We're decreasing the famines. We're decreasing things like the big dust bowl that made it so that people had to move because they were starving and couldn't use their lands. And so that is a great benefit. We're talking about people's lives saved here. And what this does is it decreases world hunger and it increases Earth's carrying capacity for humans. So there are billions of people that exist because of the Green Revolution in the United States and in other countries around the world. Now, again, there's cons. Now, the problem is that it brings negative consequences, things like soil erosion, biodiversity loss, ground and surface water contamination. So again, we got the pros and we got the cons, and it's important to look at both sides of these. So the first thing we're going to talk about is this mechanization. And this is going to be an increased use of tractors for plowing and tilling fields and using combines for harvesting, which leads to increased yield and profits, which remember, increased yields and profits means more people being fed and not starving to death. Now, a problem is that it increases our reliance on fossil fuels because gasoline and diesel fuel is used for these tractors, and it emits greenhouse gases to the atmosphere, which contributes to climate change. The heavy machinery is also going to compact the soil, which decreases its water holding capacity, and it makes topsoil more prone to erosion, which means that down the line, if you're doing too much of this, it can make those profitable lands actually not super habitable for plants, which can lead to problems down the road. So there's got to be a balance to it. So when we're talking about these crops that yield more, there's going to be two different things that we're going to talk about, high yield variety crops. And I'm going to talk about kind of these two because they are different, but they are both used. So the first is going to be hybrid or, there's hybrid and then there's genetically modified crops. And I'll talk about the difference between them. But these are going to be crops that produce a higher yield, which means you get more crop per unit of area. Now, the first part is going to be hybrid. Hybrid is going to be something that we have been doing since the dawn of time. It's just natural cross-pollinating different species or parent plants that have ideal traits. So there isn't really much science to it. It's just like, oh, look, this pea plant gave a lot of peas and this pea plant gave a lot of peas. So we will breed them together to make a better pea plant baby. And this has led to increased yield and food stability in regions that previously were prone to famine, areas like India, Pakistan, Mexico. And again, this is just kind of a natural process that we've been doing for a very long time, since humans have been having to have crops to survive. And this guy right here, his name is actually Norman Borlaug. And the reason I have pictures of him is he was very famous. He won the Nobel Prize for his work with this high yield variety crops and the cross pollination and how to maximize the yield that you got. And he's kind of seen as like the father of the Green Revolution. And a lot of his work kind of kick-started this Green Revolution. And so that's why we have pictures of him. But what he was doing was a lot of that research on how to do the hybrid to maximize your yield. Now, the next thing that we have is GMOs. And GMOs are going to be crops that use new genes that are spliced into their genome. And this is going to be a good picture here of what the GMOs versus the hybrid is. And again, GMO stands for genetically modified organism. So on the left-hand side here, we have the hybrids. And again, this is where you're just going to be crossing two parents, like naturally putting them next to each other, or you're hand fertilizing. So maybe you have a crop that's a little bit more disease resistant, and you're going to cross it with a different crop and to have a hybrid offspring that's going to be more disease resistant. Now, GMOs, it's actually really cool science. We are able to literally go into the DNA and splice and add new DNA into the DNA of these crops. Now, the cool thing is this DNA doesn't necessarily come from plants. Like you can literally take some DNA from a bacteria or a bug that is resistant to disease and splice that in and then make it part of the DNA of this plant. And then you are going to end up having offspring that are disease resistant. So 2 different ways. GMOs are going to be able to like pinpoint things a little bit better. They take less time. You're able to mass produce them a little bit better than this whole hybrid process. But both of them can be ways that you can lead to increased yields or disease resistance. Oh, that showed up early. So I'm just going to do all of them here. Okay, so GMOs, again, genetically modified organisms. These are going to have genes. I just talked about ways that you can have genes for disease resistance, but you can do them for a lot of things. You could do drought tolerance. You could do pest resistance. You could make them grow faster. You could have them more fruit, more grain, whatever type of plant you're looking at. Now, a benefit is that you get increased profitability with fewer plants lost to drought, disease, or pests, and you get larger plant sizes and greater yield per acreage. And remember, greater yield means more people being fed. Now, a downside is that GMO crops are all going to be genetically identical. They are made in a lab, so genetic diversity is decreased, and we have susceptibility to diseases or pests. Now, currently, they are good against the pests that we know of, but as we know, pests, diseases, all of that, they're going to be evolving like all organisms do. And so maybe in 20 years, we're going to have new strains of these organisms or pests or diseases that they are not going to be genetically modified to be able to fight against. And so maybe in 20 years, we have a new disease that can wipe out like literally all of our foods that we have, because especially corn is in like everything that, well, so much that we eat. And a lot of the corn that's grown in America is genetically modified. And so if we were to have a new corn disease that crops up, it could wipe that out. Now, scientists then can go and make new GMOs, but it's the fact that we have that genetic diversity lost, so they're more susceptible to disease or pests in the future. Now, an example of this is going to be BT corn is what the strain is called. It has been modified with a gene from soil bacteria to produce a protein that kills many different corn pests. So the one on the top here is going to be BT corn. The one on the bottom is going to be non-BT corn, and it has succumbed to a pest. And so that's going to be an example of just kind of a really commonly used genetically modified crop that we have here in the United States. Now, one thing that I want you all to be aware of, there's a lot of misinformation out there about GMOs, and GMOs are going to be, sorry, I have something draining in my kitchen here. But GMOs have been studied for decades, since we've been doing them since like the 60s. After decades of scientific research, there has been no scientific studies that show eating GMOs to have any harmful effects on humans. They have been proven to be safe. So that is something that's very commonly incorrect, is that GMOs lead to cancer or allergies. There have been no scientific studies that have shown that. So there are problems for genetic diversity, but health is not something that we have ever seen any scientific studies like showing a concern for. All right, next is going to be synthetic fertilizer. This is going to be the shift from organic fertilizers like manure and compost to synthetic fertilizers, which is man-made with ammonium, nitrate, phosphate. And the benefit of using these fertilizers is that it increases yield and profits, and we give more nutrients into the soil, especially soil that might have been previously depleted. So we can add in like nitrogen, phosphate, potassium, so that the soil is now healthy for plants to grow in, which again, increase yield, more people being fed. The decrease, though, that we have talked about a couple times previously, and this is something that I want you to be aware of, we will keep talking about it, is eutrophication, which you see a picture of here with that algae bloom. The excess nitrate phosphates are washed off the fields, they get into the waters, they come together into lakes and ponds and oceans, and you're going to be causing those algae blooms and cause the eutrophication. So that's going to be a big problem of synthetic fertilizers. And it creates those like dead zones where you have the organisms dying off and the oxygen depleted, and eutrophication is not a good thing. The other problem is that it requires fossil fuels for production. You have to use fossil fuels to make the fertilizer, and so that releases carbon dioxide, which again, climate change. All right, so next is going to be irrigation. And irrigation is how we are going to draw up water from the ground or nearby surface waters, and we're going to distribute it to fields to increase plant growth. There's a lot of different types of irrigation, and we'll talk about these later, but this is just kind of the general term for it. Now, what it does is it makes agriculture possible in many parts of the world that are naturally too dry and don't receive enough rain. For example, Eastern Washington is a desert, but we have a lot of farming there because of irrigation, or Southern California are a couple in our area or our region of the world where we have irrigation very much benefiting. We get to have the sunshine from the deserts, but then we also get the water, so plants are able to grow really well here. One of the problems with irrigation, though, that we are especially seeing in California is that it can deplete groundwater sources, especially aquifers. Remember that we get our drinking water from these groundwater sources as well. So as you're using up all of this water on irrigation, you're now making it so that there's less water available to people, which right now is a serious concern in California that they're having to deal with. Now, another thing that can happen is you can do too much irrigation, and overwatering can drown the roots, which means there's no oxygen access, and it can cause soil salinization, which increases salt level in the soil because you have a little bit of salt in your groundwater. So when you pump it up and spray it on the plants, you're adding that salt, and over time it accumulates, and so you can get this soil salinization when you're doing too much of this irrigation. All right, pesticides. Now, this is an increased use of synthetic pesticides, chemicals that are sprayed on crops that kill weeds, insects, rodents, and other pests that can eat or damage crops. We have had a huge increase in these since the Green Revolution. Now, again, this increases yields and profits with fewer plants lost to pets. Again, increased yield equals more people having food to eat. But the problem is it can wash off in crops into runoff, so it can get into the waterways. It can also kill or harm non-target species in the local soils or waters. Bees especially are an example of this. We are having plummeting numbers of our bees, and it is mostly because of pesticides. So it doesn't always kill the target species. It will kill a lot of them. And a famous example of this, we actually end up sometimes having new pesticides that we think are healthy that eventually we find out are not healthy. So a famous example of this is DDT. It was used tons all over the world. It's still used in some countries. And come to find out, it thins the shells of bird eggs, especially eagles. So eagles like almost went extinct for a while there. Then we found out what was causing it. We banned DDT. Their numbers are doing much better now. But we didn't realize that DDT was the problem for a while, even though we were using it widely. Another example is astrazine, and that can turn amphibians and fish intersex, which means they can grow the parts that they aren't supposed to have, which obviously leads to breeding and population issues there. Another example that's happening right now is some courts in California have recently determined that there is sufficient evidence to prove that Roundup can lead to cancer, and Roundup is used everywhere. You yourself, or you probably have neighbors who use Roundup in your yards. So sometimes we use these pesticides, and it takes a little while to find out that there's actually harmful effects to it, which can obviously be a problem. All right, so here's some information on regulation. Like, what about the laws relating to, can we just put anything in our foods? Is there methods for when you realize it's harmful? What can be done? Here's going to be some important regulations to be aware of. So the Food and Drug Administration, shortened the FDA, this is the agency responsible for regulating the safety of the USA's food supply, among other things. They also monitor medicines, cosmetics, tons of stuff, but we're talking about food right now, so that's what we're going to focus on. Now, the Foods, Drugs, and Cosmetic Act of 1938 is what gave the FDA this power. Now, there's a clause in this called the Delaney Clause that you all need to know about. This is considered one of the laws that College Board says you need to know that could show up on your AP test. So the Delaney Clause of this Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act was added in 1958, and it prohibits the use of food additives which are found to cause cancer in humans and animals. So if you have found that something can cause cancer, you can't add it as a filler to food. And so that's good that we have that. Now, one interesting note is that in 1996, this was amended so that pesticides are not included in this rule. So if pesticides are found to cause cancer, this is not something that the Delaney Clause prohibits them from using. So just an interesting side note there. But again, the Delaney Clause is a clause that you need to know for the AP test. All right, so here's going to be your practice FRQ, where you're going to be practicing identifying an author's claim. So I want you to read this section of text here, and then you are going to describe the author's perspective on GMOs and identify one assumption that they are making with this perspective. So that's going to be your practice FRQ for 5.3. Those were your notes on 5.3 about the Green Revolution.